What if controlled hyperventilation between sets could actually improve our performance? So I'm talking about that. There was, and they did a study on this actually, which I'm going to talk about right now. They did a hyperventilation aided recovery for extra repetitions on the bench and leg press. So two groups, one was a control group, one they just did spontaneous breathing, and the other was that. Now, I don't know exactly if it was exactly that type of tempo, but controlled hyperventilation is talking about expelling more carbon dioxide. It's like a Wim Hof-esque breathing. And so what they noticed, they did that, they implemented that for 30 seconds before the first, third, and fifth sets of each exercise, and they compared the groups. For the control group that just did spontaneous breathings, as the sets continued, they noticed reductions in reps from 4 to 22%, and reductions in velocity which is speed, from 23 to 37%. Now, when they looked at the group who did that, the controlled hyperventilation between sets, it actually did the opposite. It increased the repetition range ability from 21 to 55%, and velocity, so speed, from 6 to 15%. Or no reductions in these measures from the previous set. So what we noticed was that this really noticeable difference between what happens if I do a hyperventilation controlled recovery in between my sets, and what's actually happening is we're expelling CO2. We're expelling CO2, which builds up as a result. It's a metabolic byproduct that builds up a result of, fatigue, aerobic respiration, continual aerobic respiration to a high workload and high frequency and high demand, right? You're just going to build up CO2, which inhibits nerve conduction. Inhibiting nerve conduction is bad if you want to produce maximal force and continually develop strength, power, and speed. So if we do this controlled hyperventilation, we see better results in reps and velocity, most likely because we're helping buttress carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions, which is helping maintain optimal or more effective nerve conduction action potentials, which are the electrical impulses that we see with every voluntary skeletal muscular contraction. And so there's something I've been experimenting with, and it's something that we can experiment with, is this controlled hyperventilation, not to the extent of like Wim Hof, where you're doing this rapid inhalation exhalation. That's not what I believe this study was doing, but just this controlled hyperventilation where you're exhaling more than you inhale can potentially improve, or looks like it improves performance pretty profoundly, which is a really amazing tool that we can use in between our sets, where we're really trying to optimize performance and get better performance in between our sets. Who doesn't want to perform better, do more reps, move quicker? That's everybody, right? But at the same time, physiologically, and this is where the bit of the conflict, and like this is where it's good to have somebody else to talk to about this, where you just go back and forth on this nerd talk. But hyperventilation actually, when you're breathing off a lot of this CO2, because CO2 is actually a vasodilator, CO2 actually triggers the vasodilation, so capillaries to open up and take in more oxygen and blood, or blood which is delivered, blood which has oxygen in it, hemoglobin delivered to the tissue to release oxygen, to fuel the tissue for aerobic respiration and energy production. Now, CO2 is a vasodilator, so it is triggering to bring in more oxygen so it can fuel the working tissue. Okay, so it's one of the functions of CO2. Now, when it builds up too much, it becomes counterintuitive to performance. But when we're breathing off CO2, it actually results in vasoconstriction, which can constrict the tissue then, or the tissue to not take in as much blood and oxygen and hemoglobin and decrease the affinity of hemoglobin to bind to oxygen. And so potentially there could be this other side that isn't considered a potential detriment to if you take it too far. Like, we're just talking theory of physiology. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, the other side of it. but at the same time, we still saw improvements practically speaking. And so, man, to me, this is an example of what's theoretical isn't always practical. And maybe we don't understand everything about the physiology always and can't explain every single mechanism. And so I say that to acknowledge that side for the science nerds who are still with me. And at the same time, be like, hey, you want to perform better in between your sets? Controlled hyperventilation, offload that CO2, baby, and see what happens. Test it for yourself. See what happens.